I'm Alan Danks. We're here at Two People's Bay Nature Reserve, an area that I've had a lot of involvement with over the years. I was the manager here for 12 years, and I was intensely involved with the noisy scrubbird recovery program. We're here in a little bit of noisy scrubbird habitat. A bird is normally found in this area. Probably is right now at the moment, but he's not singing, so we don't know he's there. We've got Buckley's chance of actually seeing him. If he's not calling, we don't kind of know where to look. And when I talk about noisy scrubbirds singing and calling, it's only the males that do that. They're quite a sexually dimorphous species. The males are larger than the females. They're more brightly or more intensely marked. And they sing these amazing territorial songs, and the females don't. The females are very quiet. They have a few alarm calls, but they don't sing much. The males like to kind of set themselves up in territories not too far away from other males with similar territories, and they sing to each other. They have kind of song competitions in which it's all about who can sing the loudest and the longest and who can sing the most songs. And most of these territorial males have a repertoire of half a dozen or so songs. There's slight variations on their basic song. You can hear the variation, but it's most easily recognised if you record that song and put it on a computer and show it as a spectrograph. And that'll show you the differences between the songs, and people have done research on that here at Two People's Bay. The males are basically defending a territory. They're saying, with that song, they're saying, look, this is my place, this is where I live, I don't want any other males coming here. And generally the males will stay away. Except in the breeding season, particularly at the beginning of the breeding season, males that don't have permanent territories start singing on the outskirts of the other males' territories, and this causes a lot of song, a lot of singing activity. And then one of the things that characterises the noisy scrubbird breeding season is this intense singing that the males engage in from about April, May through to about September or October. And here we're right at the end of the breeding season, so typically we're not hearing any noisy scrubbird song. The females, of course, don't engage in this sort of frivolous activity. They are too busy raising young. They spend a lot of time building a nest when the time comes. In June or so, takes a female typically about 3 weeks to build a nest, a wonderfully constructed dome nest with a side entrance, sometimes an elaborate sort of roof and veranda structure and a runway that leads up to the entrance. She lines the bottom of the inside of the nest with cardboard-like material that we think is made from wood pulp and plastered on the inside of the nest, and keeps the nest very clean and dry. Of course, she's breeding in the middle of winter. After building the nest, she lays the egg, and she has an extremely long incubation period, sometimes up to 6 weeks, because she's incubating all by herself. And this is done, as I said, in the coldest part of the year. So to some extent, she relies on the insulation of the nest, but she still has to do a lot of brooding and incubating to get the egg to develop, and she does that all by herself. The male continues to sing to his mates and engage in those sort of song competitions. And when the chick hatches, it's another 3 weeks before it fledges, and then after fledging it stays with mum for anything up to 3, 4, 5 months, by which time we're well into the beginning of the next breeding season. This is fairly unusual for a songbird to have a breeding cycle like that. The long incubation period, the winter breeding, and having the young at heel for such an extensive period of time. Very unusual for songbirds. But so too is the fact that they're nearly flightless, these birds. They hardly ever do any kind of flight they have very short, rounded wings that they certainly can function. They can flap them. They can use them to assist the sort of jumping and leaping around from branch to branch. And they're crossing a little open area, they'll flap their wings as well, but they don't actually get much flight. So, so they're quite unusual. But they're also unusual because they are closely related to lyrebirds, and at the base of the whole songbird radiation in Australia that occurred back at the end of the Cretaceous period, when songbirds were first evolving. So scientifically they're very interesting birds, quite important. They have suffered enormous reduction in their range, of course. And the scrubbird is also interesting because it disappeared off the map. When it was first discovered, it caused a lot of interest in ornithological circles in the 19th century. People looked at its anatomy and couldn't figure out where to place it taxonomically. It had an unusual syrinx, the bird's voice box, which turned out to be very similar to the lyrebirds, and so they were all early on put together as being somehow related. But it had no wishbone, or just a tiny vestigial little kind of flexible bone. There's the remains of a wishbone. That's related to their flightlessness, of course. And then the other unusual thing was that they disappeared. The last specimen in the 19th century was taken in 1889. But because it was so unusual, people went looking for it. It wasn't just a case of, oh well, we can't find them anymore. People wanted to find it. They had about 20 specimens in the museums across the world. They wanted more. They wanted to know much more about it, and they wanted, Australian ornithologists in particular, wanted it to still exist. Many searches were conducted all along the south coast through the southwest, but none of those were successful until, almost by accident, it was found here at Two People's Bay in 1961. And that in itself was an unusual, or resulted in an unusual conservation story. Our bristlebird's calling again up there a bit. Because in 1961 there was a town site planned for this area. And this was, all contracts were laid down and people were selecting house blocks even. So the finding of the noisy scrubbird caused a bit of a controversy and a kind of development versus conservation battle, which, well, I'm pleased to say, the noisy scrubbird won. So it's amazing that occurred, that a development proposal was cancelled in favour of a small brown bird that can barely fly. Although, of course, it had in its favour the fact that it was scientifically very interesting, had a curious history. People had been writing about the noisy scrubbird for many decades, so it was a well-known bird, even though it was presumed extinct by many people. But the other thing it had in its favour was that it had powerful friends, and the most powerful of its friends was the Duke of Edinburgh, who leaned heavily on the West Australian government and convinced them to actually cancel the town site and create a reserve, which they eventually did in 1967, created this Two People's Bay Nature Reserve. And that was very important, not only for the scrubbird, but also for other threatened species, including birds like the bristlebird and the western whipbird, but ultimately also for Gilbert's potteroo, which was found by accident here in 1994. And that wouldn't have occurred. The Gilbert's potteroo would not have survived through to that time. It was basically rediscovered just in time, I think. It wouldn't have happened if this reserve hadn't have been created because of the noisy scrubbird, if fire protection hadn't have been put in place as it was for the noisy scrubbird, and fox baiting was brought in as well. And that, I think those things allowed Gilbert's potteroo to survive in a very, very small population, something like perhaps around 30 individuals. They were very close to extinction. They're in a somewhat better position now, but certainly back then they were in dire straits. as was the noisy scrubbird when it was found here in 1961. It had a population of less than 100 individuals confined to one small location on Mount Gardner within the reserve, what is now the reserve. But protecting 5,000 hectares of land, not having the development, allowed the population to increase. Keeping fire under control helped the population increase. And that was then used, the population was then, an increasing population in the 1970s and 80s was used as a springboard for the next phase of conservation for the scrubbird, which was creating other populations through translocations. And although there were a number of failures with that program, we weren't able to create populations wherever we wanted to, but we did get several very important colonies established, and they now carry the main bulk of the population of noisy scrubbirds. This is very dense vegetation here, but noisy scrubbirds can move through it remarkably quickly. One of the characteristics of observing a noisy scrubbird is that you'll hear it singing 50 metres away, and the next thing you know it's within a few metres of you or popping out at your feet beside a track. It's often how you get a few rare glimpses of the bird that's otherwise very difficult to see. One of the reasons they can move so quickly through this vegetation is that they have very powerful legs. They're quite long and with strong thigh muscles. They also have very powerful necks. Their neck muscles are built up, and this is partly to do with their feeding, their mode of feeding. They'll put their bill under a leaf like this, and they lift it up. So they need a bit of strength to do that, to lift it up. They don't scratch the leaves away to get at the invertebrates underneath. They lift it up and peer in there and take whatever ants, beetles, spiders, and so on that they can find. But that sort of musculature can also be of assistance when they're moving through this sort of vegetation. It's really quite amazing how quickly they can move through it. They're aided, I think, sometimes by the existence of little tunnels that are made by other animals, particularly quenda and bush rats and so on, and even quokka, which make it a much larger tunnel. And the scrubbirds certainly take advantage of that, often sitting beside or nearby the entrance to a small tunnel like that in a scrubbird area is a good way to see a bird. So it's Mount Many Peaks that we're looking at across Two People's Bay there. It's a granite mountain, like all these mountains and hills, all the coastline in fact along Albany, east and west of Albany. That's all granite that's aged at about 1.2 billion years. And that formed during the collision of the Mawson Plate with the Yilgarn Plate. Sort of thrust up a huge mountain range along this coast, or what is now the coast. And what we see in these granites is basically the base of those mountains. That granite was formed kilometres underground, many kilometres underground at the time. And so a huge mountain range that once existed in this area has been eroded, and the landscape has worn down to these basal granite rocks. So as the arrow says, we are here at the visitor centre at Two People's Bay. So this is Two People's Bay itself, and we were earlier over here at Little Beach, in this tiny little pocket cove here. This is the green area, is all of the Two People's Bay Nature Reserve. Includes this lake up here, Gardner Lake, Moats Lake, and a couple of special protection areas here for the noisy scrubbird. So this is the big sort of granite headland, if you like. This is basically a sand and limestone isthmus here, but obviously this used to be open to the sea, and this has been sort of captured in a process they call island capture. These would have been more extensive estuaries at one time, probably going back about 5,000 years. They've collected shellfish here in the lake that have been subfossil shellfish that have been dated at about 5,000 years, and they indicate when it changed from being estuarine, in other words open to the sea, to being mainly a freshwater lake. Right.
So when you say island capture, can you... I think I know what you mean.
Yeah, well, that's where you have an island offshore, close to the mainland, and then due to rivers bringing sediments down, or the wave action and currents bringing sediments along the coast, it builds up sand deposition here between the mainland and the island, and then that gradually increases until you have dry land. So then it forms like a peninsula, and that's the process that's called island capture. Of course, we have more than that going on here because there's been a raising of the land here. If you look at Sinker Reef, this is a limestone cliff, and that represents movement of the land as well. But basically, it's a process of island capture.
And in terms of plant communities, where do you find the most diversity in?
The largest diversity is here on the granite headland, because you have a mixture of sandy heath and sort of gravelly country up here that's from the granite, gravel and clays, and you have deep gullies that some of them remain moist, and well, all of them remain moist throughout the year, but some of them actually have water in them throughout the year. So those are very special areas in a relatively sort of semi-arid sort of environment. You've got these little mini rainforests in those gullies, and then you have various scrubs as well. So you have quite a lot of diversity there, more so than out here on this heath-dominated and peppermint-dominated sandy area. And then, of course, here in these areas of reserve, well, this is mostly bare sand dunes, but here you have low woodlands of jarrah and marri and casuarina that's typical of that sort of plantagenet soils. So yeah, quite a lot of diversity through the reserve, but I think it would be probably highest here on the mountain. Certainly this is an area that's been very important for the noisy scrubbird. The birds have moved out and colonised along a creek. Here are some swampy areas here, around the margins of the lake and a little bit further west, but this has been their stronghold. This is the area that the population was hanging on in when it was rediscovered in 1961. And we think those damp gullies are really important. Before 1961, there would have been a number of fires through this area, and these damper gullies on the headland managed to survive unburnt, and that would have been areas of refuge for the noisy scrubbird and many other animals as well that would find frequent wildfires very difficult to handle. Yeah, so this whole landscape that you can see here from Mount Gardner behind me, across Two People's Bay, Boulder Hill, many peaks, out to Chains Beach and Bald Island is a noisy scrubbird landscape. We have noisy scrubbirds right through that landscape, probably about 1,000 individuals, rough guess at the moment. And it all came from Mount Gardner behind me here through a translocation program where we took a small number of birds every couple of years and seeded them out into the landscape. Large amount of work over 20 or 30 years, a lot of volunteers, a lot of community effort, a lot of government money, but it's been quite successful, and it's been demonstrated a couple of times that it is the best way to protect a fire-sensitive species against the wildfires that inevitably happen in this kind of landscape. The vegetation in this landscape was basically born to burn. It's very flammable, and wildfires will happen quite frequently in a landscape like this. And it seems a bit paradoxical, I guess, that you have a bird like the noisy scrubbird that likes long unburnt vegetation and doesn't handle fire all that well. But here, if we spread the population out, have little colonies or large colonies spread throughout this area, they can withstand the occasional wildfire. And that was demonstrated in 2005 when we had a big fire on Mount Many Peaks, that took out half the population, but it was only half the population. It was demonstrated again a couple of years ago here on Mount Gardner when the mountain was burnt in a wildfire, lightning strike, and it knocked out the original noisy scrubbird population, or most of it, and yet the population as a whole continued because it was widespread, more widespread than ever it was. But this, although it's probably 30 or 40 kilometres from here to Bald Island, around the coastal area, that's a very small area on a world scale, and yet all the world's noisy scrubbirds live in this area. There aren't any noisy scrubbirds anywhere else in the world. So it's a very important area for conservation, just from that point of view, but also from the point of view of other species. Areas that were set aside and protected here in the name of the noisy scrubbird have been of great benefit for other threatened species like western bristlebirds, western whipbirds, ringtail opossums, quokka, and of course the most spectacular example of that was Gilbert's potteroo, which, like the noisy scrubbird, was thought to be extinct. People had searched for it and couldn't find it. It had been missing for something like 90 years. It turned up here in Two People's Bay Nature Reserve in 1994. That wouldn't have happened if this area hadn't been already set aside. A lot of research going on and a lot of protection of the habitat for the noisy scrubbird. We're looking across Moats Lagoon here to the mobile dunes. You can see that there's a little bit of vegetation on them, but basically that's a set of dunes that are moving inexorably into the lake. They look like they'll eventually divide the lake into two, and that's a process that's been going on for many years along this part of the coast. And you can look at those dunes, and the ones in the background that are more stabilised, they're just older dunes that have come in since the Pleistocene and basically filled in the old estuary that was here until about 5,000 years ago. The dunes themselves are very interesting. They occasionally expose middens and things like that. They're also kind of interdigitating with the wetlands in various places, particularly in that eastern section there, forming some wonderful tangled swamps and with trees standing in the water and so on. Fascinating place. This lake here is one of the deepest lakes locally. It runs to about 6 metres deep and is quite fresh, entirely fresh water, whereas the other lakes in this collection here are brackish. But this lake is fed by a number of streams, and the streams are important conservation areas because they house the last populations of a small native fish called Galaxia trutaceus that basically only occurs here in this Two People's Bay area, and that's an entirely landlocked system that the fish lives in, even though its relatives live in systems where they have access to the sea and they come up into the creeks and rivers to spawn. This population doesn't do that because it doesn't really have access to the sea. It nevertheless moves from this lake up into the small streams and breeds up there and then goes back down into the lake. One of the streams that they were living in had a gauging station on it, and some years ago it was realised that was interrupting the migration upstream that needed to occur annually for the population to survive and thrive, and a fish ladder was constructed to help the fish get up the stream. This is a gauging station on the Gudger River, which flows into Moats Lagoon, and this is really important habitat for the little native fish called Galaxia trutaceus, those spotted trout minnow. And it uses this stream as part of its habitat. It needs to move upstream to breed, to mate and lay eggs, and then go downstream to access the lake, and the young, of course, go down as well. But a gauging station like this, a V-notch weir, interferes with that. The fish aren't able to get upstream, and so some years ago this fish ladder was built to help them, and that just provides, because of the sort of a stepped ladder that goes down, you can see it bends around there and does several zigzag lines, and each of the step between each of the little compartments is only a few inches. The fish can get up that, and they can come up against the current up through here and into this pool and all the way upstream, and that construction of this actually allowed the fish to access another 2 or 3 kilometres of habitat, which of course is not very much, but in the scheme of things, here this particular species only has, I don't know, I'm guessing, but just a number of small streams. Each of them would only be 3 or 4 kilometres long, so the total length of its habitat in terms of streams would only amount to a few tens of kilometres at the very most. So adding another 3 or 4 in is really important, and it provides, this is one of their best streams actually. These are deeply incised into the sandy profile, often quite narrow. This is here where we're looking at a pool is much wider than the stream is normally, or most of its length, and vegetation overhangs the water, and there's a lot of shaded habitat. The water is very dark from all the tannins in the vegetation, and that overhanging vegetation is really important for as a food source, where the little invertebrates and so on drop off into the water, and the fish feed on those. It's quite important to have that very narrow shaded habitat. Now, this has been a very successful little project, and the work that's been done here to monitor how effective it is has been very good. I don't know the details of it at the moment, can't bring them to mind, but it has been shown that the fish are actually moving upstream. But also other species as well use it. The turtles, I've often seen turtles in here trying to get upstream through these, although the slots are actually fairly narrow for the full-grown turtle. There's another species of fish as well, a pygmy perch that utilises the same habitat. So another little conservation story from Two People's Bay. What we're standing on here is seagrass that's been deposited by wave action, and that seagrass is coming from out in the bay there. It's quite an extensive seagrass meadow, I think you'd call it. But all of that dark blue out there indicates beds of seagrass. Pretty important for as a nursery for a lot of marine life out there. But storms and wave action uproot some of the seagrass and bring it in. It's deposited on the shore here, and these deposits of grass on the beach come and go with the seasons. It's more extensive in the winter time, less extensive in the summer, and you get a bit more beach. But particularly it builds up down here in the southern end of the bay, because the currents are not as strong here. It accumulates to quite a depth sometimes. But then it rots, and those nutrients from the rotting of it leach back into the water, and that provides nutrients for marine life out there. So it's all a nice cycle.
Wow. Wow. Oh, this is a great location for this.
Yeah. Motorbike frogs. So it's a little bit of a small, tiny estuary, really. And so right here, within metres of the ocean, we've got frogs. And you can hear those, you might not be able to hear them, but they're motorbike frogs. In this little bit of fresh water here, which is connected to the estuary. Well, this is sort of the southern end of Two People's Bay. That's Two People's Bay, that you can see the beach over there, going around to Boulder Hill, and the northern headland, if you like, of the bay is across there. Norman's Beach at the foot of Mount Many Peaks, and the main ridge of Mount Many Peaks continues on to Waichinukup, and then you have the ridge of Waichinukup National Park, the back of Chains Beach and Bald Island over there. Bald Island's very important nature reserve, very important for seabirds, a massive colony of great winged petrels that breed out there, as well as little penguins, a number of New Zealand fur seals, and Australian sea lions also hang out there. They don't breed on the island, but it's an important haul-out site for them. But the island's main value has been as a seabird colony until recent years, when we put noisy scrubbirds there. Back in 1992, I was involved with taking the first birds out there. We were a bit hesitant because the vegetation looked fairly marginal in terms of noisy scrubbird habitat, but we thought the value of the island as a predator-free island would possibly overcome that, and that's been brought home to us in spades in recent years, and the population of noisy scrubbirds on Bald Island now exceeds that of the source population here at Two People's Bay. It's a very important colony for noisy scrubbirds, and they've done very well out there, we think, mainly because there are no predators, no terrestrial predators like cats or foxes, or introduced predators. The only other predators out there would be aerial predators like eagles and goshawks. Yeah, when I walk through areas like this, I'm really aware of the changes that have occurred here. I've known this area for 40 years, nearly 40 years, and over that time you do see a lot of changes. And this place here, for instance, where we're just on the edge of a swamp at the base of this dune, this used to be quite a dense woodland, quite these trees here used to be a whole mass of them. And there was a big storm back in 1984 and the sea came over those rocks and across the little estuary of the tidal pool there, and basically swept up against this dune and destroyed the woodland here. And one of the unfortunate consequences of that was that there was a noisy scrubbird in this little pocket here, a relatively small territory for a noisy scrubbird, but he seemed to manage quite well, probably because there's a lot of food in this very wet area. But of course he couldn't handle the storm, but he survived. He must have got out in time, and was up in the heathland up on the top there for a few months after that storm. And so we had this noisy scrubbird running around in the heathland, which at the time was a bit unusual. He eventually disappeared, of course, but there are lots of changes like that, dramatic ones that have occurred as a result of storms or wildfires, but also changes that go on routinely all the time, a kind of succession, I guess, vegetation succession, where the changes from heath and scrub into woodland and into low forest or something like that. And to see those kind of changes that occur over a long period of time has been very satisfying. There are areas of heath with emergent peppermint shrubs that I knew 30 odd years ago. They're now peppermint woodlands with a sparse sort of heathy understory. It's very interesting to watch those changes occur.
So dieback's come through this whole area, has it? Here.
Yes, that's right.
There would have been the Banksias growing throughout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is kind of a post-dieback landscape here. And in fact, back in the early days, when the reserve was fairly new, back in the 1970s, people thought that this was quite a pristine area. And even after people became aware of dieback, it wasn't appreciated that this was already an infected landscape, because it had kind of closed in, regrown with a suite of non-susceptible species. So it wasn't easy to recognise it in the first place, but we do understand it better now. So dieback must have come in here quite early on, sometime early last century probably.
So if this didn't have dieback in it, what would you be seeing? What could you see here?
You would see many more Banksias and Hakeas. I mean, if you look at areas nearby that haven't been affected by dieback, you'll see some massive stands of those Proteaceae species, and they're almost entirely missing from here. There's just a few, like that example that we looked at a little while ago. Dieback is ridge here in the southwest has made dramatic changes to the vegetation in many landscapes, and this is one of them.
What makes one plant species susceptible to dieback and another not?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ben. Susceptibility certainly runs in families. So if you take the Proteaceae family, which is the family that Banksias, Hakeas, Grevilleas, etc. belong to, we see a lot of those species are susceptible. And in the Myrtaceae family, the eucalypts, tea trees and so on, there's some of those are susceptible, but not to the same extent. And then other groups of plants like sedges don't seem to be very susceptible at all. And exactly what makes the one susceptible and the other not, I don't really know. But one of the things that I think seems to make the Proteaceae susceptible is the root system that they have. And bear in mind that Phytophthora dieback is caused by an organism that attacks the roots. So there's something about the structure of the roots that leads to a greater susceptibility, and Banksias certainly have these sort of mat-like fibrous root systems that seem to be good places for those little fungi to invade and attach to. So then basically when plants die from Phytophthora, it's their food and water supply is being cut off from the roots. So you see the plant actually goes out all at once. It dies all in one hit. One of the ways in which we can tell whether a plant has been killed by dieback or whether it's some other cause, like some of the other aerial-borne fungi, for instance, is by looking at the pattern in which it's died. If it's died limb by limb, then that's certainly not dieback. But if it's gone out all at once, it's highly likely to have been caused by dieback.
What about over here?
Yeah, well, that's a Banksia attenuata, and it's looking not thriving, let's say. And it's certainly got bits and pieces that are dead on it. That's not been caused by Phytophthora. That would be possibly aerial canker or it may just be a result of the salt-laden winds that sweep across this area. But I suspect, given that there are a few other more healthy-looking attenuators like the one in the distance there, I suspect that what we're looking at here is an aerial canker effect. One of the interesting things about whaling that occurring here, or certainly that I find interesting, is that there were a number of local Aboriginal people from this Two Peoples Bay area who joined the whalers, serving as harpoonists and various other functions on the whaling ships. And one of those was a man called Nebinyan, who is remembered simply because towards the end of his life, when he was no longer whaling, he went to the mission up in the Katanning area, and there he was seen by Daisy Bates, who recorded his stories, and including a song about whaling that he had composed. Whaling became a very important thing for the Aboriginal men of the area because it was one of the good ways in which they could get a wife, of course, because they had access to money and food and so on. But I sometimes think they would have had a very adventurous life. You know, the change was probably very adventurous, just making a living in this area anyway on land, but then to go away to sea for several years and to other countries, other parts of Australia, would have been an amazing thing for them to do. I think it's wonderful that we still have a record of that.
You were saying that the whaling ships potentially changed the vegetation here a bit?
Yes, we don't have too much evidence of that, but I think, given that you have just over there on that side of the ridge a she-oak woodland and mixed in with a few eucalypts, it was probably very similar over here, but the whalers would have used a fair bit of firewood. One of the reasons I think that they came into this area is for the firewood, the water and the fresh meat. So they would have made some changes here. And then, of course, there would have been more fires burning the area. That would have changed it too. And then, since the reserve was created, the lack of fire has probably brought its own changes. This area we're looking at here hasn't been burnt for, I don't know, possibly 50 years. So, before that, people wouldn't have seen this place without fire for that length of time. And we're seeing this change from being a pure heathland turning into a shrubland, which will then progressively become a woodland. We've got one of our western bristlebirds calling here very close by. He's one of the endangered species that has benefited from this reserve. Western bristlebirds occur at the moment only in two populations, one here at Two Peoples Bay in Mount Many Peaks area and the other out in the Fitzgerald River National Park. At the time of European settlement, they were much more widespread, occurring in the Perth area, the coastal area near Perth, as well as around Margaret River and Augusta. So their population declined dramatically after colonisation and have survived just in these small pockets. Well, this is Banksia coccinea. It's rather spectacular Banksia actually, but this is probably not its best flower. The way I like it is when it's just starting to open up, like these flowers here. I can get a little closer. These guys here, moving around a bit in the wind. You can see the leaves are a bit damaged. That's mostly a salt spray effect. We're only 100 metres or less from the ocean here. But Banksia coccinea is a fairly important food plant for honey possums, but unfortunately it's very susceptible to Phytophthora dieback, and this area here has quite a lot, has dieback in it, and most of the Banksias have been taken out by the Phytophthora. Yeah, so here you can see a Banksia, looks like Banksia attenuata, that's been affected by dieback, and it's basically just died all at once. This has been dead for some time, of course, but what you would see when it was first affected would be that the leaves would all turn yellow, basically over the whole of the plant, and then they would die, and the shrub would stand there for some years and then collapse like this. This is a very typical effect of dieback. It's surrounded by non-susceptible plants, of course, all these shrubby heaths here, the melaleucas and the Anatheria sedges. They're doing fine, and they will eventually cover over this area where the dead tree is now. And I would predict that maybe in 10 or 15 years you wouldn't even notice that this tree had been here. You might just find a rotting stump. That's about it. So in that way, the vegetation just covers over and recolonizes, and it completes the process of transformation from a Banksia woodland to a shrubland and heathland.